Hello again. It's time to talk about our Bible quest here at the Bethany Christian Church. And now you have been reading what we call the minor prophets. They're not minor in significance, of course. They are very important, but because their books are shorter, they were all gathered together. 12 of them were gathered all together into one scroll, and sometimes they're called the latter prophets, as opposed to the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. But these 12 form the minor prophets. Now, these minor prophets, the first group that we're going to look at, all have the same kind of poetry and images in them. And so I want to make that clear first. When you read them, they're almost always made up of short narrative sections and then poems that are images and symbolic. When you're reading them, you look at them and you realize that it's different than the narrative that you've just read. The narrative, of course, is easier to read, and then the poetic images. And so understanding those is a little more difficult, but we'll make that clear as we chat about them. Now, the first of these minor prophets is the prophet Hosea. And in some ways, he is a very interesting man, because Hosea is a man who marries under God's suggestions or impetus. He marries a prostitute, a woman named Gomer, and he has 3 children, or she has 3 children, and he isn't the father of any of them, seems to be clear in the text. And then God asks him, when she has left him and so forth, that he is to go and redeem her, to bring her back into his house and be then her family, his and her family. Now, this short narrative of that story, and it's an odd story at best, is really expanded in the poetry section, the image section of Hosea, because there we come to see that this is a symbol. This relationship between Hosea and Gomer become a symbol for the relationship between God and Israel, or his children, because the picture is that as Hosea goes and redeems Gomer, God goes and redeems Israel. And that is the picture that is seen in the poetic images. And it's really quite an interesting thing, because the important message that comes from reading the poetry is that as Hosea has to redeem Gomer with both redeeming love and a price, it's the same is true with God and Israel. The main theme in all of these prophetic books is always justice and righteousness. God has to do what is just, but always his heart is full of righteous love and the compassion for his people. The next one of these books is interesting as well. Wasn't that an interesting story in Hosea? But Joel is interesting too. It's a relatively short book, but he was obviously, Joel, we don't know too much about him, but we know that he was very knowledgeable about temple worship. He may have been a priest even. We don't know that for sure, but he's very aware of priestly customs and the way priests work. But his major poetic images has to do, again, with this theme of the day of the Lord and justice and goodness. But here, his image is of a plague of locusts that come and take over a land and just lay waste to it. And so we can see that kind of a strange thing. The nice thing about Joel is, though, by the way, Joel is quoted in the New Testament in the book of Acts, Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost. His sermon text is from the book of Joel. So you'll see that when you're reading the New Testament. But let's talk a little bit about Amos, and his story is interesting too. Now, he was not a priest. He was not from the temple situation. This is a man that comes from a shepherd's background, but he is perhaps given the most difficult job. He has to go and prophesy in Israel. That's the northern kingdom. He has to go prophesy in Israel during the reign of Jeroboam II. And here's the thing, it was a prosperous time. The people were doing well, and they had made a lot of money, but they had also put up idols everywhere. And the deal is, Amos has to go and prophesy against that situation. And it's always hard for a prophet to prophesy doom when things are going well. But that's what he has to do. And he talks about what is going to happen. This isn't going to work out, this apparent prosperity. And finally, he does talk about the return of David's dynasty and how a king is going to come out from that. That will be, of course, Messiah. And so Amos' book is, again, narrative a little bit and then poetry. Now, just at the end, Obadiah, it's the shortest book in the whole of the Old Testament, and it contrasts in its short verses a sort of a brother against brother image. You know, Edom and Israel, or the kingdom of Israel and Judah, really come from two brothers, Jacob and Esau. We know their story back earlier in the Old Testament, how the one deceived the other one and so forth, all of that. But here, Edom is, the people of Edom are descendants of Esau, and of course the people of Israel now are, of course, the descendants of Jacob. Now, what happens in this very short book is we're given a picture of how Edom takes advantage of Israel when it gets overrun by the Assyrians. Instead of sort of helping the family out, this a little bit of brotherly love here, we see the opposite is true. And in that short image, though, we see that Obadiah is able to stress the Lord's universal sovereignty, not just over Israel, but of all of the surrounding people and really the whole world. And so as you were coming along there, you may have thought, wow, how are these two connected together? It is interesting to note this, though. The word Edom, the people of Edom, they are spelled in Hebrew the exact same way that the word Adam is explained in the book of Genesis. So the Edomites are really just like us. They are really the whole world. And of course, Jacob's new name was Israel, God's kingdom. So as you were reading those, I hope you got this feeling of poetry and image, but always the theme, justice and goodness, justice and righteousness. We'll be talking now in a little while about some other minor prophets, but that's enough for today.